Hello, my name is Marian Lovett and I will be leading a presentation on the U.S. deaf and hard of hearing inmate population. The 2011-2012 National Inmate Survey conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice reported that 6.5% of all inmates in America had a hearing disability. You can see that right here. Here you can see it being divided between male or female. Male had a higher rate. This is the different age groups. And this is the different races. And then if you're interested, these are all the different disabilities that's been reported in 2011-2012. Now this is compared to the general population, where only 4.3% had a hearing disability, as you can see right here. Again, male, female, male's higher, different age ranges, and different races. And again, this is 2011 to 2012. According to the United States Department of Justice, an estimated 6,613,500 people were under correctional supervision on December 31st of 2016. So, if according to the National Inmate Survey statistic, about 429,877 of those inmates were deaf or hard of hearing. Now, this is a large number of people affected, yet the U.S. Department of Corrections has ignored their needs. This has been a long-standing issue spanning multiple decades. In 1995, one judge wrote that the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision has sentenced its inmates to a prison within a prison for its lack of services provided. 25 years later, the problems persist. Inmates today are facing issues that should have been resolved long ago. Now, in this presentation, you will hear about personal accounts and research regarding the difficulties inmates in America face who are deaf and or hard of hearing. To begin, I would like to introduce you to the legislation that exists that impacts deaf and hard of hearing inmates. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, 29 U.S. Code, subparagraph 794, guarantees persons with disabilities equal access to any entity that receives federal financial assistance, either directly or indirectly. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is also referred to as the ADA, 42 U.S. Code, subparagraph 12141, extends these same rights to inmates in all state and local facilities. Title II of the ADA, the U.S. Department of Justice Regulation in Title II, 28 CFR Part 35 and analysis thereto, 56 Federal Regulation 35694 of July 26, 1991, clarify the requirements of Section 504 and extend them to institutions that do not receive federal financial assistance. This means all correctional facilities, both governmental and private, must provide auxiliary aid services such as qualified interpreters to allow deaf and hard of hearing inmates to participate in all prison programs and proceedings, including rehabilitation and educational classes, appointments, and court appearances such as disciplinary court or court of appeals. These laws are crucial to deaf and hard of hearing rights. In essence, deaf and hard of hearing inmates must have equal opportunities as hearing inmates. Now, unfortunately, these pieces of legislation are often underfunded and not enforced. This must change in order for deaf and hard of hearing inmates to be provided with necessary services while imprisoned. Now, one possible recommendation to change this is by having each state establish an office overseeing ADA compliance in all state correctional facilities. Each facility would report annually to an officer, and that officer would either approve or disapprove of the facility's ADA policies and compliances. That said officer would report to the Executive Council, which would inform the governor. Federal correctional facilities would report to a designated person within the Department of Justice, who then follows the same process as state offices would, reporting to the Attorney General. If after 90 days, no changes are made, punitive actions will be taken. Now, these actions would be up to the governing bodies. Now I would like to talk about the core of deaf culture, American Sign Language, or ASL, is the language used by the deaf and hard of hearing community. ASL does not resemble English. It has its own syntax, grammar, and unique rules. In an available Common ASL dictionary, there are 5,600 signs compared to the over 500,000 in the Oxford English Dictionary. For plenty of English words, there is no equivalent sign. One study reported that 30% of the deaf population is functionally illiterate, reading at a grade level of 2.8 or below, and approximately 60% of deaf individuals are unable to read and understand the Miranda warning, which is, according to one linguist, written at about an 8th grade level. Now, for many, English is their first language, or ASL is their first language, and English comes second. This was the case for Jerry Cohen, a former inmate of the Georgia State Prison. Cohen, like a lot of deaf inmates, has limited written English skills, making communication out of sign language extremely difficult. Yet, in prison, he was denied interpreters for activities such as doctor's appointments. He was forced to write back and forth to communicate, which proved to be challenging. As Cohen put it, words were too hard, with his limited understanding of the English language. Intentions could not be made clear over a piece of paper. And he was not the only inmate who experienced this problem. Jeremy Woody, another former inmate of the Georgia State Prison System, stated, "While I was in prison, they had no American Sign Language interpreters. None of the staff knew sign language, not the doctors or the nurses, the mental health department, the administration, the chaplain, the mailroom. Nobody. In the barbershop, in the chow hall, I couldn't communicate with other inmates. Pretty much everywhere I went, there was no access to ASL." Similar to those in solitary confinement, deaf or hard of hearing individuals experience isolation while imprisoned. They have no ability to communicate with others who do not know ASL other than by written communication, but written communication is not always possible. One time, Woody had to appear in disciplinary court. No interpreter was provided and his hands were shackled behind his back. He was unable to write and he was unable to read lips. He was unable to defend himself. He was deemed guilty. Another time in which Woody faced communication barriers were his doctor's appointments. The doctor expected him to be able to read lips, but like before, Woody was unable to, often because when you're meeting someone new for the first time when you're deaf, you don't know how their lips form over certain words, and it's very difficult to read. After you know someone after a while, reading lips becomes easier. But then again, reading lips is not an exact science. So they had to write back and forth, but Woody does not have a high literacy level and finds English very tough. Like Cohen, words became too difficult. So Woody stopped going to the doctors and eventually he developed cancer. It wasn't specified what kind of cancer he developed. Even with the guards, Woody had trouble. Writing notes to them was considered personal communication, and it was against prison policy to have personal relationships with the inmates. So some refused to write to Woody or even read his notes. Woody had to be careful with the few guards that would write and read notes, because to other hearing inmates it looked like he was snitching. No matter how many grievances Cohen and Woody filed, they were all rejected or left pending. Deaf and hard of hearing inmates face other problems as well. Deaf and hard of hearing inmates cannot hear public service announcements in jails or prisons, so they depend on other inmates to get their information. Another thing is many correctional televisions do not have closed captioning, so deaf and hard of hearing inmates can't enjoy the recreational time. And another accommodation that we won't really think of as hearing people is alarm clocks. Deaf and hard of hearing inmates need a vibrating alarm clock, which prisons don't often provide. Sometimes it can take months or even years to get these accommodations. And another thing is something to consider is deaf cultural norms. So in deaf culture, getting someone's attention by tapping them is often normal, but in prison culture, that's seen as an act of aggression. And for other prison people, if they call your name, you're expected to answer. Well, with deaf people or hard of hearing, they don't always hear. So people could think it as an act of defiance and have a negative attitude towards that prisoner, whereas they were deaf and hard of hearing, so they just didn't know. Things to think of when you're outside prison walls. To be deaf and hard of hearing, as you can see while incarcerated, is beyond frustrating. One could argue that their sentence is harsher than their peers because of the problems that arise with their inability to hear. The troubles deaf inmates have regarding communication are not limited to inside the prison, to outside as well. Deaf people cannot simply call home. Instead, they require either a text telephone, which is referred to as a TTY, or a telecommunication device for the deaf, which is a TTD, a video relay service, which is a VRS, or a video phone. A TTY is a special device that came out in the 1960s that lets people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or speech impaired use the telephone to communicate by allowing them to type messages back and forth to another party instead of talking and listening. A TTY is required at both ends of the conversation to communicate. Now, this outdated method has been replaced by video relay services or video phones in most places, but not in all correctional facilities. Family members and friends of deaf or hard of hearing inmates do not always have a TTY, especially not in today's age, inhibiting them from being able to communicate with their loved one in prison. The updated method of video relay service and video phone should be present in every prison or jail. Video relay service allows persons who are deaf or hard of hearing to communicate through a telephone system with hearing persons. The VRS caller, using a television or a computer with a video camera device, contacts a VRS communications assistant, which is CA for short, who is a qualified interpreter. They communicate with each other through sign language and a video link. The VRS CA then places a telephone call to the party the VRS user wishes to call. The VRS CA relays the conversation back and forth between the parties in sign language with the VRS user, and then with the hearing individual they speak. Video phones remove the interpreter from the equation by having direct communication between two people who can sign. One simply needs a video phone or can download an application to their smartphone to have the ability to video chat. All they need is an internet connection. By video phones, both parties can sign and have a normal conversation. They do not have to take time to type, and they're conversing in their first language, which is ASL. Some prison officials cite concerns over cost and security. Yet, prison officials in Virginia, which installed video phones in 2011, said they have no major security issues. They reported that the video phones are recorded as those of all of their offenders. The calls are reviewed on a regular basis with an interpreter. See, there's no breach in security, and TTYs are more expensive, even in prisons. Full access to unrestricted communication is a core value of the deaf culture. Yet, in many prisons, it is currently unattainable. When they do not have the updated technology of video relay service and video phones, they are restricting communication with the outside world. When they do not have interpreters ready available for activities and appointments, they are restricting communication in the present environment. Denying deaf and hard of hearing inmates participation in society through limiting their interaction with the world is unjust. It goes against their cultural values. Correctional facilities must not only update the communication technology and increase the presence of interpreters, but also ensure that deaf and hard of hearing inmates do not serve a sentence of isolation. Communication devices aren't the only pieces of technology a deaf or hard of hearing person has to worry about. Many people who are deaf or hard of hearing have hearing aids. Hearing aids are very expensive to purchase and maintain. The average price of a digital hearing aid is about $1,500, with top-of-the-line devices costing from $3,000 to $5,000. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for hearing aids to get broken in prison or jail by either the inmate, other detainees, or even correctional guards. While in prison or jail, that individual does not have a very substantial salary and cannot always afford to buy a new one. There are states whose Department of Corrections will purchase the hearing aid for the prisoner, like California. California's DOC policy is to purchase the appliance if the prisoner is indigent. Otherwise, the inmate shall purchase prescribed appliances through the department or an approved vendor as directed by the chief medical officer. Now, indigent is not clearly defined and left very vague. Without a precise definition, it is hard for inmates to prove their indigency. So, some individuals are labeled not poor enough to receive a hearing aid. and they have to go on without one. When an inmate has a hearing aid, he or she has to buy batteries, which on average cost $18 for 24 at a drugstore, and are usually replaced every 2 weeks. On a limited income, they cannot always afford to buy new batteries. If they do not have outside support to help them financially or provide them, that inmate is left without their hearing device. For someone who's dependent on a hearing aid, this is very frightening, especially if they do not know ASL. That would be like taking a hearing person's hearing away for a day. They would be petrified. Hearing aids and batteries should be covered under medical expenses, so in case they need to be replaced, correctional facilities should be responsible for replacing them while an individual is incarcerated. Now, with all the problems I've discussed and that exist in correctional facilities, all the problems I have discussed exist in correctional facilities built to house the hearing. But what if there were correctional facilities meant to house the hard of hearing, or the deaf? Every state should have at least one correctional facility with deaf or hard of hearing unit. In this unit will be people who have been screened prior to entering prison or jail and identified as having hearing loss. Deaf and hard of hearing inmates from all over the state will congregate together. They will reside separately from the general population, if so choose. Some people, like those brought up in a hearing environment, might feel more comfortable in the hearing population. They have the choice to stay in the deaf or hard of hearing unit or be mainstreamed. In this unit, everything will be deaf friendly. Now, Texas has already constructed such a unit and has over 100 inmates. A few other states have done the same. Now, why should more states follow in Texas' lead? Because those who are deaf and hard of hearing face greater risk than those who are hearing. Deaf and hard of hearing inmates are at a higher risk for being the victim of sexual and physical assault. In addition, deafness is very isolating, and research has shown that the isolation in prisoners is a major cause of psychological breakdown and psychosis. Deaf/hard of hearing units also saves the state a ton of money. By having all the deaf and hard of hearing inmates in one place, only one interpreter is required for every class, if it's not already conducted in sign language itself, and then you don't even need the interpreter. So, for example, when the unit for the deaf was established in Texas, one interpreter was able to serve numerous functions, whereas previously many interpreters had been required at a greater expense. Not only will deaf unit improve the deaf and hard of hearing prisoners' quality of life and safety, it will also alleviate financial pressure on the state. These difficulties deaf and hard of hearing inmates face within the United States correctional system are not impossible to overcome. There are solutions that can be attained through adjustments and changes in the correctional facilities' practices and policies. By enforcing relevant legislation and funding them, such as the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, increasing access to communication through updated technology and interpreters, covering medical expenses associated with hearing loss in correctional facilities, and establishing deaf and hard of hearing units, America can provide services necessary to meet the needs of deaf and hard of hearing inmates. With these changes, the prison within a prison the federal judge once declared the New York Department of Corrections and Community Supervision sentenced deaf inmates to will exist no more. Thank you for viewing my presentation. Researching this subject proved very challenging because of the scarcity of information available. I believe this is due to lack of attention the subject has received from the public. Just because deaf and hard of hearing inmates are a subset of the general population does not mean their importance is diminished in any way. Greater research should be done and more focus should be had on the deaf and hard of hearing inmate population. If you are interested in the subject, I encourage you to read Deaf Prisoners Are Trapped in Frightening Isolation, published by CNN for further information on what it is like to be deaf in prison. If you have any questions, please contact me at mel1123@wildcats.unh.edu. Thank you again and have a great day.